Testament, written and narrated by John Chapman. I'm writing these words upon the walls of my house. I considered doing it on the inside, like some skulking delinquent, but I think this requires something rather more brazen, confrontational even. It is, after all, a protest of sorts. Though my house is of modest size, and my cursive has suffered somewhat over the years, I am a doctor, after all, there should be ample parchment for what I intend to say. Incidentally, you might have already noticed that we recently had our house painted a rather splendid duck-egg blue. I dread to think what my wife would make of this flagrant display of vandalism. It's difficult to tell the time, since for the past few weeks I've neglected to wind my watch. What is more, the power in the house has been shut off for almost 3 months now. If I were pressed, I would say it was around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. Not that it really matters, of course. By now I would typically be 2 sheets to the wind, already halfway through a bottle of scotch or brandy. My hand trembles as I write, perhaps you have noticed. It might be the effects of alcohol withdrawal, but could just as easily be due to what I know I must now write. In any case, I'm going to try as hard as possible to stay sober until it is done. My tool of choice this fair morning is a thick permanent marker, the type that smells quite delectable if you take a good sniff at the business end. I took a handful of them not 30 minutes ago from the general store down the road. As with my daily supply of booze, I'm able to take pretty much whatever takes my fancy without need of payment. You see, I have a special arrangement with the proprietor of the store. I had to pause in my writing then because I couldn't stop laughing. A good sense of humour is necessary when the alternative is screaming from the top of your lungs. The grammatical syntax of the English language dictates that I take an anti-clockwise journey about the 4 walls of my home. Already my meandering scrawl has taken us across the north and west faces of my house. You've no doubt already noticed my pride and joy sitting on the driveway. A 1979 Jaguar XJS in British racing green, of course. Ordinarily, it would be parked in the garage with an oil tarpaulin snugly fitted to its shapely form. But I must confess that I haven't taken such good care of her recently. She could do with a jolly good clean and a new coat of wax, but I won't bother. Even if the fuel tank wasn't as dry as an old bone, why on earth would I want to drive anywhere now? As we round the corner to the south face, I notice the sun is somewhat lower in the east than I thought. Perhaps it is only 9 o'clock after all. Not that I really give a damn. My house is situated on a small hill, along with 2 other Victorian piles. My neighbours were very pleasant people when they lived here. George was the headmaster at the local school, his wife a somewhat shy and retiring librarian. Terence and Julia resided in the other house, along with their 3 young children. Terence was a banker who smoked and drank far too much. I always had to remind him of his high blood pressure, and his wife a very dedicated housewife. She occasionally made a gift of freshly baked buns which she would leave on our doorstep. Such a dear young girl. It pains me now to think of them, the children in particular. As you can tell, if you are following my rambling sentences with any sort of dedication, you are now on the eastern face of our house. At the time of my writing, the view behind you is still rather splendid. Of course, it is far quieter than it should be, and the fields beyond are turning fallow when harvest should already be in full swing, but it still retains much of its charm. If you look carefully, you can just see the roof of my surgery, and adjacent to that, the primary school where my wife used to teach. As I look to my left, just peeping out beside the steeple of St. Nicholas's Church, the levitating tulip slowly rotates on its spot. A quarter of a mile to the right, I can see 2 of the giant purple rods, each of them submerged in the terraced houses of Montgomery Lane. They vibrate rather violently in the mornings and give off a sweet aroma not unlike popcorn. And there, far above the distant hills, I can just make out the hazy blue outline of a hexa-triangle diamond slowly coming in to land. For the umpteenth time now, I've questioned why I'm doing this at all. If, by some small miracle, you are now reading these words, scrawled so inelegantly across my house, you already know what's happened. I don't know whether I should congratulate you on your survival, or offer my commiserations that you are not fertilizing the soil like all the rest. In any case, I have little to offer you in terms of understanding, less still of hope. I suppose I should confess, at least to myself, that I'm writing this little piece for my own benefit. I have considered the possibility that I've imagined the whole damn thing, that I'm trapped in some kind of psychotic episode. As frightful as that possibility is, it would be immeasurably more preferable to what I believe has actually happened. By writing these words, I hope to at least remind myself that I was once sane, that there was once a world that existed beyond my garden that still made sense. I've just thrown away the first permanent marker and pulled another from the waistband of my trousers. My wife wouldn't have cared for the cavalier way I just discarded the spent pen into her rose bushes. I can almost picture her now, the vague look of bewilderment tightening her jaw, the stern set of her eyes, a joking reproach that will make me smile in spite of my chastisement. What would she make of all of this, I wonder? I think about that a great deal. Where was I? Oh yes, the gigantic geometric objects sitting in our quiet little town. You see, when we get down to brass tacks, I find it rather difficult to describe what's happened. As a doctor, I must confess to having very little imagination for the esoteric. The thing that drew me to medicine and the underlying disciplines of biology and chemistry in the first place was a sort of steely pragmatism. As a young man, I always detested the prosaic, the abstruse, the abstract. I preferred my feet to be planted on firmer ground. The sciences, whilst far from complete repositories of knowledge, were all based on rational, observable, tangible fact. What we have here today, however, defies explanation. My beloved scientific grounding has been made a mockery, reality itself rendered a sham. Had I been a painter, or perhaps a writer, I might have done some justice to their description, or hazard a guess at their purpose. But then again, I doubt anyone could faithfully accomplish such a feat. They are, as they used to say, utterly beyond our ken. Let's try this on for size. They came to Earth 3 months ago. Oh my goodness, what a crazy thing to set down in words. It sounds like the musings of a gibbering idiot, or perhaps the first line of a trashy science fiction novel you'd want to sling into the nearest bin. I never thought I would be capable of thinking such words, let alone scrawling them across the side of my house. So, once again, I have to cast some doubt upon the ability of any former artist or writer to pay homage to our visitors, because of all the many science fiction novels and films churned out in the last century, not one of them ever anticipated this scenario. Certainly they had imagined countless alien encounters, both friendly and otherwise, but did they ever envisage an invasion of complete and utter indifference? I think not. Humanity has always held itself in the highest regard. Despite the fact we've long since known that we are not the centre of the universe, it's never quite prevented us from believing the very opposite true. When the aliens came, they paid us as little heed as one might a solitary ant on the other side of the world. I've gone and used the word alien now, haven't I? That's a rather loaded term to use now, isn't it? Did they come from across the vast gulf of space? Or did they pop out of the sea or the molten core of the earth? Perhaps they shuffled their way out of another dimension entirely. No one knows. Or rather, no one knew. Now that I've told you about the invasion, I'd better follow up with another weighty statement. As far as I know, there is no one else alive on Earth but me. That last pen wasn't finished, but I threw it away nevertheless. I had to sit down for a moment and gather my thoughts after writing that last line. It's funny how the mind works. I've been dealing with this new reality for the better part of 3 months now, but committing such a statement to paper, I mean to house, somehow makes it all the more real. You don't know how close I came to opening my bottle of scotch and drowning my sorrows. But no, I was strong. I suppose you have to be when you're the last human alive. Again, I've been somewhat forward in assuming the latter. I've inferred that the rest of humanity has been killed off. Perhaps you're imagining a genocide perpetrated by death rays or some other cataclysmic event. In many ways that would have been far kinder, but it wasn't like that at all. First off, there may be others like me, scattered across the globe, who yet retain their dignity, their fragile grasp on reality. There's no way of telling. But if there are such people, they are equally as cursed as myself. The cruelest thing is to retain some semblance of sanity when the entire world has gone to hell. The rest of the world's population, those who are not already dead, are, shall we say, somewhat afflicted. I still encounter them from time to time on my walks around the town. Upon first impressions, one could easily mistake them as survivors. They draw breath, they scoop rotten fragments of food into their mouths, they even defecate in the streets, but they can no longer be considered human. To give you an example, yesterday afternoon, Mr. Gregory, our former gardener, came to visit. I was already well and truly inebriated by then, contemplating whether to follow the bottle of vodka with a quarter bottle of brandy or a half bottle of sherry, when the screech of the iron gate heralded his arrival. His eyes were glazed as he walked past me, grunting quietly like a contented animal. After a moment of hesitation, his trembling hand reached for the front door, his palsied hand trying and failing to turn the door handle. I got shakily to my feet and was preparing to usher him away with my broom when he suddenly turned and slowly walked back the way he had come. If there was any vestige of emotion left in his crumpled face, it was merely disappointment. There are many like him. Even my wife can be counted amongst their number. I last saw her 2 weeks or so ago. It pained me to see her so dishevelled, so painfully thin. In the beginning, I tried to keep her locked in the house. I was able to take care of her then, to feed her and bathe her. But as the weeks passed, I realized it wasn't doing either of us any good. So, one morning, I opened the back door and let her shuffle her way back out into the street. She never even glanced back at the home we had shared for the past 20 years, nor even muttered a parting farewell. She was my wife no longer. There were warnings in the beginning, though no one really understood them as such at the time. It is only retrospectively that I can piece some of them together like a lonely detective trying to solve the murder of 5 billion people. Perhaps the first inkling I had that something might be amiss was a news article I read in the Times one Sunday morning. It was taken from a paper recently submitted to a physics journal concerning our own dear sun. A solar observatory in Hawaii had registered a very strange and anomalous reading. For approximately 33 milliseconds, the radiation output of our neighbourhood star had diminished by a factor of 10,000. It was as though an absent-minded god had switched off a light and upon realizing his mistake had hurriedly flicked it back on. The conclusion of the paper was that the findings were due to a technical fault, resulting in a very thorough and expensive overhaul of said observatory. The measurement recorded was a physical impossibility and therefore immediately discounted, consigned to the humorous and anomalous items in the latter pages of the newspaper. Back then it was easier to dismiss facts that didn't sit neatly within our understanding of the universe. As an amateur astronomer myself, I would, on occasion, peruse a number of journals first hand in the town's library. In the weeks that followed, I found other curiosities that concerned the rotational periods of Venus and Mercury, even the tilt of our own planet. But once again, none of these were ever taken seriously by the scientific community. The tabloids took these tidbits of scientific craziness and served them up as fodder for their deplorable rags. I can only imagine that someone somewhere was pretty spooked by these observations, that boffins up and down the land were scratching their heads in bewilderment. But to watch the evening news, you wouldn't have thought anything was amiss. So, the other clue that something new and otherworldly was soon to be foisted upon us was actually witnessed, in the flesh, so to speak, by yours truly. I had, over the course of a week or so, noticed some odd behaviour in those regulars who frequented my practice. Patients who usually came complaining of arthritic pain or inconsistent bowel movements came instead because of crippling headaches. I thought it strange at the time, and whilst I prescribed mild painkillers and advised rest, I was reminded that my wife too was suffering from this same ailment. It was an exceptionally hot summer, so I surmised it was merely the higher than normal air pressure that was to blame. A few days later, I was sat with my wife watching the 6 o'clock news. We had just shared a delicious meal of roast lamb and boiled potatoes and were working to finish off the bottle of wine that had accompanied it. My wife's headache had ended suddenly that morning and she was in good spirits. We talked of small things and sipped our wine. I remember that she looked radiant in the glow of the television set, her laughter buoyed by mild intoxication and the absence of pain. A news item stopped our conversation short, and we switched our attention to footage of a smouldering wreck. A Boeing 767 carrying 245 passengers had crashed an hour before in central London, killing everyone aboard. The news itself was shocking, but it was what happened next that chilled me to the bone. The newscaster, solemnly conveying the grisly details, began inexplicably to laugh. I know only too well that sudden shock and extreme grief can do very strange things to one's emotional state, and for a few fleeting moments I assumed this to be the case. But then her laughter became hysterical, and with a clenched fist she proceeded to hit herself repeatedly in the face. The camera operator jerked the view to the side in time to see another member of the crew collapse to the ground. There was the sound of a muffled scream, and then the broadcast was lost. I remember turning to my wife, my consternation on the cusp of voicing my alarm, when I saw her face become slack. The wine glass slipped from her fingers and fell upon the carpeted floor. The last coherent words I ever heard her say was, "It tickles," before she walked calmly into the kitchen and began hitting her head against the oven door. Things rapidly descended into chaos from that moment. With some difficulty, I managed to restrain my wife to our bed using a length of rope I had found in the garage. Other than a trickle of blood from her nose, she appeared unaffected from her episode, but she was clearly suffering from some kind of apoplexy. I quickly ran into the drawing room and reached for the telephone, but to my dismay, the line was dead. In desperation, I ran out into the street as the sun was setting and saw the first lights descending from the sky. I remember screaming, and I think I may have even fainted, for I woke up much later to darkness, sprawled in the herbaceous border beside the front gate. The night was completely silent. There was not a single sound intruding upon the air. Disorientated, I entered our home and found my wife still tied to the bed. She was giggling to herself quietly, her hips rhythmically gyrating against the mattress. I stifled a sob and went instead to the window, if only to look upon a scene that still made sense. That was a mistake. Upon the horizon I saw a huge lozenge-shaped object, glowing yellow and purple. It was the size of a tower block and hovered 100 feet in the air, turning slowly like some fairground ride from hell. The days that followed remained something of a blur. I remember walking for miles and encountering more of the unearthly objects. At first I hid from them, but soon I learnt that they were completely indifferent to my passage. Corpses littered the streets, trails of dried blood running from nose and ears alike. Those that still lived behaved, like my dear wife, as though they had lost their minds. I found a young couple rutting dutifully in the middle of the street, grunting like wild beasts. An old lady of some 80-odd years ran hell for leather across the town square before cracking her skull against the plate glass window of the chemist. I saw a half-naked man holding a tennis racket in one hand and a sewing machine under his arm. He grinned crazily and repeated the same word over and over again like a mantra. Wheelbarrow, wheelbarrow, wheelbarrow. So, as a final thought, I should probably talk about what our new guests are up to. The glowing orbs, the silver tulips, the ubiquitous hexatriangle diamonds. You might ask of me what our new overlords are doing with our beautiful world. The short answer is, I haven't a bloody clue. Early on, I prepared for the little green men to tumble out of their craft and lay waste to those shambling remnants of humanity that remained. But that never happened. They come, they go, they come again. This myriad assortment of shapes and forms, like a grotesque carnival that makes you want to scream. Some are the size of automobiles, others might be as large as mountains. Sometimes they glide soundlessly through the air, sometimes they scream or boom like thunder. Sometimes they disgorge fragrant clouds, or they dazzle the eye like firework displays. One day I watched a huge metallic cylinder slowly descend into a field as I sat quietly on a stile near old Trudgeon's farm. Of all the craft I had seen, this was perhaps closest to what might have graced the cover of a science fiction novel. With a resigned dread, I waited for it to land and for its inhabitants to come and find me. But instead, moments before it touched the ground, it split into more than 1,000 pieces, as though countless invisible wires had carved it up like a piece of cheese. The glistening chrome fragments peeled slowly from the main body and fell to the ground, floating like monstrous petals far more gracefully than the pull of gravity might otherwise have allowed. Where they alighted upon the spoiling wheat, geometric shapes of every colour and hue blossomed like flowers wrought of iridescent metal. If you can find purpose in such events, you are more enlightened than I. I'm on my 4th pen now, just in case you are interested. I don't have any more once this one has bled its last ink. Every time I pass the front door with my trailing words, I spy my bottle of scotch waiting patiently for my return. I'm getting tired of this charade, tired of these smelly words. Today will be my last. As you might imagine, I've given considerable thought as to how I'll leave this ruined world behind. I may not have mentioned earlier, but I took old Trudgeon's shotgun when I went to save his animals. His farm had been untended for more than a week before it occurred to me they might be starving in their captivity. But I need not have worried, for they were thriving upon the field. My heart rejoiced at the sight. Not all is lost, it would appear. Those domesticated animals we enslaved in our arrogance, our unflinching dominion of this world, may outlive us all. I took his gun for protection, I suppose, though I never encountered anything that might warrant such a lethal form of defence. Ever since, I have often contemplated the dramatic ending blowing my head off would achieve. As appealing as the idea remains, I'm worried that in my soon-to-be inebriated state, I might end up wounding myself and dying a slow and painful death. I'm something of a coward at heart, so I think I'll go with the easiest route out of here. You see, I've got enough morphine upstairs to kill a small herd of elephants. Once I'm fully tanked up on the bottle of 18-year-old single malt my wife got me last Christmas, I'll put myself out of my misery. I refuse to watch the madness around me in my final moments. Instead, I intend to spend my last waking hours with my wife. After several days of searching, I eventually found her in a hedge down the road. Miraculously, she was still alive, though only just. I put her to sleep last night. In her death, she looks like my wife once more, dearest Sylvia peacefully asleep in our bed. Tonight, I'm going to unearth our old wedding photographs, and we can look back on that impossible dream together, when life made sense and we were so gloriously happy. I would wish you luck, dear reader, but I have none left to give. God bless you. Sylvia May Williams, born 18th of September 1933, died 16th of June 1986. Dr. James Williams, born 12th of March 1928, died 17th of June 1986.